What's something that you love to give, but you absolutely hate to get? Advice, right? Advice. Doesn't really matter if the problems that other people are experiencing are insignificant or if they're infinitely complex, right? We are great at having solutions for other people's problems. And if only our friends, right? Our spouse, our kids, our neighbors, our coworkers, our boss, if only our politicians, if only celebrities, if only random people on the internet we'll never meet would listen to our advice, the world would be a better place. Being silly, of course, but I see this in myself, right? I seem to have advice for a whole swath of different people, and some I've never met and don't know their situation, who are in so many different stages of life and have different problems, some I've never been in, that it just makes me laugh at myself just a little bit, right? I don't have much trouble determining for other people how and they should eat or think or vote or live. But if someone was telling me, if someone told me how to think or eat or vote or live, that's a line. You just don't cross that line. And so I was thinking of different types of advice that we give and receive, and I came up with 3. Of course, there's more, but I thought 3 might be helpful for today. Firstly, there's good advice, right? There's good advice. If you're humble enough to receive good advice, because that's the problem, right? Pride is the problem from us to receive and adopt and actually live out good advice because it threatens us that somebody actually might know something more than us. But if you're humble enough to receive good advice, there's something about it that's so illuminating, so refreshing, and maybe you've experienced this before, right? There's a problem you had in your life you couldn't really see clearly on, and you had a conversation with a friend or a mentor, and it just kind of broke things wide open for you. They were able to see something that you couldn't. There's a book in the Bible called Proverbs, and it's filled with some really great advice. And it says this: "The heartfelt counsel of a friend is as sweet as perfume and incense." There's something so valuable about good advice. This week, I asked on Instagram through our Hope City account, I said, what's some of the best advice you've ever received? And we got dozens and dozens of people responding to that question, and they were great, and I wanted to share just a few of my favorites here. One was this: "Life is 10% of what happens and 90% of how you react to it." That's true. I don't know about the numbers, if that's exact, but the sentiment is true. There's another one: "Treat people with kindness. You never know what battle they're fighting." That's wisdom. That's really good advice. And then maybe my favorite: "Don't sweat the petty stuff, but don't pet the sweaty stuff." I don't even know what that means. I try not to think too hard on it. But the best advice that anyone ever gave me was this: live God's truth through your personality. Now, let me unpack that because it's not very intuitive, not very catchy, but this is what it means. It means that you can actually know what is true, that it's not relative. And although we live in this post-truth cultural moment where we're okay with trading facts and objectivity for preferences and opinions, you can actually live your life on the foundation of truth. And that truth is best experienced in the person of Jesus. Jesus said himself that I am the way and the truth, and I have found that to be extremely reliable. So number one, you can know God's truth. And if that's true, it's best that you know it really well. So that's number one. Number two, you can live out or you can express God's truth through your personality. In other words, who God made you to be. You don't have to be ashamed of your temperament or your quirks. You can embrace it because God didn't make a mistake when he made you. So that frees you to live God's truth, not your opinions or preferences, but God's truth through the uniqueness of you. And for me, that's brought so much freedom and clarity in my life. That has been really good advice, and I'm still trying to learn how that works, but it's ongoing good advice that I try to follow. Then there's bad advice. Bad advice, the hashtag bad advice was trending on Twitter, and I thought some of them would be good to share, that we can all agree this is bad advice. First one says, if you accidentally cut somebody off, pump your brakes and spell out "I'm sorry" in Morse code. Don't do that. That's bad advice. My dad told me to go up a lot of these actually that I was looking through started with "my dad told me." I don't know what that means, but anyway. My dad told me the escalator was voice activated, so I spent 10 minutes yelling, "Go up," before he told me it was broken. My grandma told me to put bacon on my pimple so that it would shrink. I just picture me as a teenager with bacon just all over my face. Lastly, my dad told me that if I do something that I'll regret in the morning, just sleep in until the afternoon. Sometimes bad advice is really easy to spot, right? You're like, okay, that's bad advice. But sometimes it's trickier. And maybe you have a story of how your life was derailed or it took a really sharp turn in a way you never hoped it would because you followed some bad advice. You know firsthand the sting of bad advice. So there's good advice, there's bad advice, and lastly for today, there's unhelpful advice. A few years ago, I was asked to perform a wedding for my friends in Mexico. And so I brought my entire family with me, and my eldest daughter at the time was 2 years old, and about an hour into the flight, she had a total meltdown. I mean, we were talking nuclear. I've never seen anything like that since or before, but it was something that we just didn't know how to deal with. And if you've ever had your kid throw a major tantrum in public, you know that how difficult it can be on a parent's psyche. It's this real test of intense patience to try to get your kid back to the state of equilibrium. And that intensity is multiplied when you're in a giant metal flying tube and you have all these strangers who you know their senses are being assaulted and they have no way to escape and you have no place to hide. So Kim and I, my wife and I, we're pulling out every stop that we know, right? We came prepared for this. We brought snacks and books and coloring supplies and even more snacks and movies, iPads and bribing the heck out of this kid, right? I mean, we tried everything. We had so many snacks that we couldn't believe none of this was working. Next 2 hours, this is going on. And Kim and I, we had just stress sweat coming out of every pore. It was so exhausting. To our core, we were just tired. And it may be the worst moment imaginable. A lady comes up to us and gives us this advice. You should try giving her a snack. Yeah, we tried that. We know. That advice, it wasn't bad advice. Maybe poorly timed. It wasn't good advice. It was just really, really unhelpful. And so I nodded to her in the politest way I possibly could at that time, and I just ignored her solution to our problem. That's not a bad thing to do, right? When people give you bad advice or advice that really you just don't understand how that can be helpful, a good way forward is just to ignore it. In fact, the only way to keep sane is to ignore the onslaught of messages and people trying to have input into our lives every single minute of every single day. Think about the ads that are coming at you for telling you how to live your life better, right? To the keyboard warriors and the social comments, right? Social media comments, to even well-meaning acquaintances. All these people want to have input into your life. And really, it's foolish and stressful to try to incorporate all of those messages into your life. So when deciphering what's good advice and what's bad advice and what you should take and what you should ignore, there is a filter that we need to have, right? And the filter is this. You have to consider the source of the advice. Do you know the person? Do they know you? Are they trying to sell you something? Are they projecting their fears onto you? Do they have your best interests at heart? Or is there something else at play here? And when it comes to people who have bad solutions or just really unhelpful solutions for you and the source is a little suspect, the best way forward, ignore it. But what do you do when you don't like God's solution to your problem? And don't move on from that too quickly, because that's a real problem. That's a real tension, and not just for Christians. I think it's wider than that. And if you're here and you're not a Jesus follower, you need to know that there are things in the Bible that are really difficult to understand. There are things in the Bible and ideas in the Bible that Christians really have to wrestle with. I mean, you really have to wrestle with these things. The other option is to just pick and choose what you like, what you agree with, and the things that suit your sensibilities. And some people do that. Some people try to follow Jesus that way. And I think that's a terrible idea. Amongst some of those reasons that's really bad is that when you pick and choose the things that suit your sensibility, the things that you understand or agree with, you build your life on your own wisdom. And if you looked at some of the choices you've made in your life, you'd say, geez, that's not a very good idea. And to set yourself up as a better and wiser ruler and Lord of your life than God himself, that seems like a recipe for a disastrous life. The best description in the New Testament of what it means to be a Christian and follow Jesus What that looks like, it comes from Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 16, and we went in detail on this verse early in the year, but I want to circle back because I think it'll be helpful for us today, and it says this from Jesus. Whoever wants to be my disciple must, you need to bold and highlight this, deny themselves and take up the cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Jesus here is ultimately talking about obedience. To deny yourself means that you no longer count yourself as boss. You almost give up this sort of sovereignty in your life that is obviously very important to us, not just as individuals, but as a culture, and choose to take your marching orders from somebody else, even if you don't agree with them. And there are going to be times when you don't agree with Jesus' advice for your life. When you don't understand, or you don't think it'll work, or you don't think it'll be helpful, God's solution to your problems. And that's hard. That's a hard thing. So if we choose to instead deny ourselves, but instead indulge ourselves and choose our own way, we ultimately are living in direct opposition of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And we are saying in function that I like my way better, so I'm going to ignore you, God, at least on this one. And that's a real temptation. Jesus' advice when somebody hurts you is to extend forgiveness. And if you've ever been in a situation where you have been hurt and you have to extend forgiveness, you realize that's just not a flash in the pan, easy thing to do. That's just not good advice. That would be extremely difficult advice to follow. Jesus tells us that when someone betrays you or cuts you to the very core, that the proper response is to love them. Jesus' prescription to the intense anxiety and stress that many of us experience on a day-to-day basis in life is to not worry, but instead to let him worry about it. That's a hard thing to do. Jesus' advice for us when it comes to our finances, and we don't want anyone's nose in our finances, even God, but Jesus' advice to us when it comes to our money is to give first, to save second, and to spend third. Well, that's different than everything we've been taught, maybe not from our parents or from our church, but from the world and the way things work, right? We spend first, and we deal with the consequences. Our future self will deal with that bill, right? Spend first, save second, and if we have some loose change around, then we'll give. But Jesus says, no. That's really hard advice to follow. And Jesus doesn't even leave our sexuality off the table. He says this when it comes to that if anyone who looks at another person with lust, they have already committed adultery. They have already committed a sexual sin in their heart. If today you're here and you're not quite sure about the whole God and church and Jesus and Christian thing, and you hear me rattle off these snippets of advice that Jesus gives to the most important areas of our life, maybe you don't know what to do with that or think about that. Maybe you're wondering, is this good advice? Is this bad advice? Is it unhelpful? And if you follow Jesus, maybe you've wondered that at times as well. And we've already landed that when people give us solutions to our problems that is a little bit suspect, you don't really see how that's going to work out, that the best way forward is to, ignore that. So again, what are you supposed to do when you don't like God's solution to your problem? We're in the second installment of a series of messages we're calling Aftermath. And the term aftermath is used to describe a period of time that follows a sort of reality-shifting type of event. Certain moments in our lives and even in our own personal lives that change absolutely everything, right? Getting married or having a baby or losing someone who's really close to you. If any of those have ever happened to you, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's this period of time that follows the event that is categorically different than the time preceding the event. My father passed away 6 years ago, and the aftermath of my dad's passing has been significant. And to this day, the tangible new reality is so up front and center in my life. We can't escape it. Things have never gone back to the way that they were before he passed, and I doubt they ever will. It's changed everything. And of course, there's events that don't happen to maybe individuals and just family units, but larger sections of people. Think of something like a natural disaster, like the floods that are happening all across our country. These floods are creating a brand new reality for people The aftermath of these floods is going to have a profound change on hundreds of thousands of people's lives. It's change everything. But then there's these events that are so macro, they're so big, that they change almost everything for almost everyone. Think of the world wars or the invention of the printing press or maybe 9/11. But the one reality-shifting, nothing will ever be the same, this changes everything type event that stands above the rest is the resurrection of Jesus. It's so much bigger than you could ever imagine. And it would be wise to do some critical research on how much that has shifted. I started putting together to try to help us understand that thing, and all of a sudden it took up my whole message because it's just so profound, the change that the resurrection of Jesus has had. So this series, we're looking at these reality-shifting encounters that Jesus had with people after he rose from the dead. And so today I want to look at the New Testament book of John, chapter 21. And John was Jesus' very best friend, and he wrote about Jesus. Not what he believed about Jesus, he wrote what happened, and that's a really important distinction for us to make. Now, I realize that not everybody who's listening to this is on the same page as me when it comes to the authority of Scripture in your life. But you need to know at Hope City, every single week, we're going to come back to the Bible, week after week after week, because we've experienced the dependability of its wisdom, of its advice in our life. And we believe that if you follow its advice, you can build the best life imaginable. But beyond that, as if that isn't enough, beyond that, and most importantly, it points us to Jesus. And we believe that following Jesus is the best decision that anyone could ever make. So here's some context to the story before we dive in. Jesus has been arrested, killed, crucified, placed in a tomb with a giant stone rolled across the tomb. 3 days later, some of his close friends, they go to visit the tomb, and the stone has been rolled away, and Jesus isn't there, and the disciples are freaking out. Their best friend, and maybe more than that, the person that they're putting their hope in for their future and the future of their country has been brutally murdered, and they're wondering, are we next? And so they're gathered together trying to make sense of everything that's happened. And just then, the resurrected Jesus shows up. And what do you do with that? Because he was dead. And dead people don't usually stop being dead, but it happened. And so now they have to figure out, what's the new framework that I view life and process life through? Because everything has kind of just been blown to pieces. Then a week later, Jesus shows up again, and they realize it wasn't just a hallucination. Like this actually happened. Then in John 21, we read about a third encounter that Jesus had with his disciples. So starting in verse 1, I'm going to read it here for you. It says this. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and the 2 other disciples were together. If you're counting, that's 7 of the disciples. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, well, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into a boat, but that night they had caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat, you'll find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish. That's John's way of saying, this dude just bailed on us and left all the work for us. Anyway, Peter's funny. For they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So we need to have this understanding about the disciples. They had left absolutely everything to follow Jesus. But now Jesus isn't around, at least in a way that's consistent or a way that they could predict or in a way that makes a lot of sense. And so there's confusion for these guys. What do we do next? And so when you're confused, you kind of just go back to what you know. And for them, it was fishing. So they needed to provide for themselves. They have to eat. And we know that at least Peter had some family. And so they had to provide for themselves and for their loved ones. And so they spend the entire night fishing, and they come up absolutely empty. And you can imagine how frustrating that would actually be. They weren't just going out for a guy's fishing trip. Like, this was their life. That's like going to work all week and not getting paid, right? It's frustrating. And this isn't, I think when I read this, I just sense that their frustration and disappointment is not just about the fish anymore. Yeah, they worked all night and with nothing to show for it, but they just followed Jesus for 3 years, and they're wondering, what do they have to show for that? They're processing that. And so Jesus appears on the shore and gives the most seemingly unhelpful advice that he possibly could. And he says, hey, throw the net on the other side. When I read that, I was brought back to this moment on the plane with Emery throwing a tantrum about the most unhelpful advice ever. Do you think the disciples are like, we tried that. We've been out here all night. Like, you think a boat width, that's going to make a difference even if we didn't try? Like, Jesus' solution to their problem, it honestly wasn't a very good idea. Throw the net on the other side. And it would be easy enough to ignore. Unless, of course, you consider the source. 3 years prior to this story, Peter had a very similar, an eerily similar incident to this with Jesus. And I want to read you it. It's found in Luke 5. It says this. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by fishermen who were washing their nets. So he got in one of the boats, which is hilarious that he just took a boat. But anyway, he got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, who that is Peter, okay? And he asked him to put out a little from shore. And he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. There's something that happens when you become a parent, and something I realize that God gives you a gift, right? It's a secret weapon that was once used against you, but now by the grace of God, it's given to you to wield responsibly. But when you use it, it confounds those who you use it against, and it's quite simple. It goes like this. Because I said so, right? 4 words. Because I said so, right? Your kids want a reason for absolutely everything. Dad, can we have more dessert? No. Why? Dad, can we jump off the deck? It's grass. It's soft. No. Why? Dad, can we shave the dog? I don't know. Why? Right? No, why? They want a reason for everything. You want to know why? Because I said so. You're my creation. I don't have to explain myself to you. I made you. Just listen to me for once in your life. Peter didn't understand and didn't agree with Jesus and what he was suggesting here, the advice. But he did it anyway. And the reason he did it was because Jesus said so. Is that enough for you? Is that enough for you? Do you trust Jesus to take him at his word, even if you don't agree or understand or think it will work? The story continues in Luke 5, verse 6, says this. When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. And so in John 21, Peter finds himself in a similar spot to where he was 3 years earlier in this exchange. And he would have remembered the first time Jesus asked him to do something that he totally didn't agree with. He would have recalled that Jesus' way worked even though it didn't make any sense, and that Jesus could be trusted even when he didn't understand. And this story reveals an idea that's so powerful and so transformative that if we can understand it, it can change our life and our faith, and it's this. God's way is better than our way in absolutely every way. God's way is better than our way in every way. Because the resurrection of Jesus means this. What was impossible is now possible. Dead people don't stop being dead. That's not a thing. That's not possible. But Jesus did it. Throwing your net onto the other side of a boat after fishing all night and then catching an absurd amount of fish. That's not a thing. That's bad advice. But what they thought was impossible became possible. And there are stories from this church, and I have my own stories of things that were totally impossible becoming possible. When I was in college, I played basketball, and I really hurt my ankle. I tore my deltoid ligament coming down after a rebound on someone's ankle, and it was brutal. 12 weeks in an air cast was the diagnosis. It's one of those things that you couldn't even touch your ankle to the floor without just searing pain coming up your leg. A week later, I was at church, and I had my friend, his pastor, he prayed for me, and I don't know what to tell you. But I took it off. I shouldn't have took off my air cast, and I started walking around. And the next week, I started playing basketball, and my ankle was healed. I don't know how to say that to you. And maybe you're sitting here and be like, that's not possible. You're right. It's not possible. It's impossible. But it happened. I don't know what to tell you other than it happened. And I can tell you stories of people from this church where impossibilities became possible. You can have conversations with people who attend our freedom session, who go into that ministry with such deep hurt and such deep pain that really the only answer you could give them that makes any sense is, well, that's just tough luck, and you're just going to have to absorb that pain into your life, and that just has to be the new normal. But guess what? They go through freedom session, and they find total freedom and healing from their past pain. Impossible has become possible. You talk with people who attend our Alpha course, who are dragged there by a friend, and they don't want anything to do with Jesus, and they come just to be skeptical and to make fun of things and poke fun at Christians because they're so silly. And then they leave with a relationship with Jesus that changes everything. What has become impossible in their mind is totally possible. Now, when people come to Alpha course and they're skeptical and they're a little hard to deal with, I love it because I know what can happen, because I believe that the impossible is possible. You can have conversations with students in our youth program who their dad has left them, and they have such bitterness and unforgiveness in their life that really there's no option for them but just to live that out. But yet they'll go on a retreat and they'll have this moment with God which changes everything, and they can honestly say, I forgive my dad. What is totally impossible has become possible because dead people, they don't become undead. But Jesus changed the game, and all bets are off. Jesus said something to his disciples before he was crucified. And he said it after he gave the disciples and a multitude of people some really, really difficult teaching that they had to wrestle with. And many people did wrestle with it and left. And that sometimes is the response. But other times when you wrestle with it, you stay. And after you've wrestled with it, you're stronger than when you were before. And so the disciples have this really hard teaching from Jesus, and Jesus says something to them that they wouldn't understand on this side of the resurrection, but once Jesus raised from the dead, they're like, oh, Jesus said this. With man, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. And that is totally true. For you today, for your situation today, that is true. So what are you supposed to do when you don't like God's solution to your problem? You listen anyway. You listen anyway. And so the question that I want to leave with you to wrestle through today is this. What is something that God is asking you to do that doesn't make any sense? What's God asking you to do that doesn't make any sense? Maybe for you, there's a little stir in your heart and your spirit to switch careers, but that doesn't make any sense because that means less security. That means we won't get to go on those vacations. What about all that time that I spent to get to where I am? I don't know what to tell you. Maybe with your finances, there's this urge to spend it in a different way. You kind of have a goal that you want to buy, and maybe you've been even disciplined to try to get there. Maybe you're even close, but you got the stir to spend it in a different way. Maybe you heard the Adira story, and you're like, duh. What do I do? You have to make a choice. Maybe you have been hurt so deeply that the last thing that you can do is extend forgiveness. It is impossible because they don't deserve it. But you hear this demand that Jesus has on you, the marching orders to forgive and love them anyway. And in theory, you agree, but in practice, you just can't. It's too hard. It's impossible for my heart to change. What do you do when you don't like God's solution to your problem? You listen anyway. That's my advice. Because God's way is better than our way in every way. Let me pray for you. Jesus, as we read about you and we listen to your words, we're brought face to face with this real tension. Can we trust you when we don't understand, when it doesn't make sense, and when we don't want to? Can we trust you with our kids and our spouse and our career and our finances? Can we trust you with our addictions and the problems that we just can't see a way out of? Today, Lord, not just with good intentions, but with real faith. Jesus, we declare, yes, yeah, we can. Or give each person here whose heart just longs to follow you the courage to do so in spite of their fear. Let us be people who day by day continue to learn what it means to deny ourselves and take our marching orders from you, especially when we don't understand. I pray that we would be a church, that Hope City would be a church marked by obedience, that we wouldn't default to our own preferences, our own ideas, but we would love and we would listen to your spirit, to your voice, and to your word. And Jesus, for those who are facing impossible situations today, would you inject hope into their life? And because you came back from the dead, all bets are off. And what seemed impossible is possible. And all you ask is complete trust. Lord, we trust you. In your name, amen.